All right, so today we're going to be diving deep into this concept of Christian Pharisaism.
Yeah, interesting.
Yeah, and we'll be looking at this article called Simply Christian Pharisaism.
Okay.
And I think this is going to be a really interesting one.
Yeah.
It's something that I think we've all encountered
I think so.
to some extent.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Looking forward to it.
yeah, me too. So the article starts out by really highlighting this kind of paradox that I think a lot of Christians face,
Right?
which is that they're called to be like Christ,
Mm-hmm.
to be, perfect in every way.
Yeah.
And yet at the same time,
Well, we're human.
we're
right?
human, yeah,
So that's where the tension lies.
exactly. And I think that's something that the article really kind of hits on right away.
Yeah, and it's this gap that grace is supposed to bridge, right? It's not about earning your way to perfection. It's acknowledging that,
Yeah.
you can't.
Yeah,
And then, letting something bigger than yourself step in.
absolutely. And I think that's a really important point to emphasize. Because the other thing, I think it's easy to get caught up in that, like striving for perfection.
Right. Yeah.
And
It can be overwhelming.
it can be, yeah. And then it kind of loses sight of, the grace that's supposed to be the center of it all.
Totally. And then it leads to that judgment, right?
Yeah, exactly.
When you feel like you have to be perfect,
Yeah.
then you start judging others for not being perfect.
And it kind of leads us into the next point that the article brings up, which is how different branches of Christianity view their relationship with God.
Okay. Interesting.
So the article contrasts like the high church
Mm-hmm.
or the liturgical traditions,
Yeah.
the ones with all the rituals, the sacraments.
Where membership and participation are key.
Exactly.
Yes.
With those that are more about personal relationship, not religion kind of approach.
Right.
But I thought it was really interesting because even within those two broad categories, there's still a spectrum.
Oh, for sure. For sure.
So, for example, the article talks about how Catholicism is viewed by some as being more transactional
Interesting.
in its view of faith.
So, emphasizing the law
Mm-hmm.
and the idea that salvation is earned through, good deeds and sacraments.
Yeah, like almost like a spiritual contract in a way.
Exactly. Yeah.
Whereas orthodoxy, the article was saying, leans more towards this idea of theosis or deification.
Which is a fascinating concept.
I know.
It's the belief that humans can gradually, become more like God
Right.
through a process of spiritual transformation.
It's a very mystical kind of idea, isn't it?
It is. It's rooted in Eastern Orthodox mysticism.
Yeah.
And it really shapes their whole approach to faith. It's less about, earning heaven
Right.
and more about ongoing spiritual growth.
And just becoming,
Yeah, becoming more divine over time.
wow, I'd never really considered that perspective before.
It's really beautiful.
Yeah. It makes you realize just how differently people can experience, the same faith.
Yeah.
But then the article brings up a really interesting point about people who lean really heavily on their own interpretation of Scripture,
Mm-hmm.
And how that can be a little bit tricky sometimes.
Right, because it can lead to a very, self-centered kind of faith if you're not careful. It's easy to, kind of impose your own desires and biases onto the text.
And come up with something that's totally different from, what it was maybe originally intended.
Yeah, you end up with a distorted view.
Exactly. And then on the flip side of that, the article talks about how these more formal liturgical settings, while sometimes people criticize them for feeling impersonal,
Yeah,
the article actually argues that they are intentionally God-focused.
that's interesting.
Yeah, it's about directing your attention and worship towards God,
Mm-hmm.
not making it all about you and your personal experience.
Yeah, it's a really fascinating tension, isn't it?
Yeah.
The more personal approach, you risk it becoming too human-centric. While, these structured traditions,
Right.
they can feel distant to some.
Yeah.
So it's this balance between personal experience and communal worship.
Yeah, it's finding that sweet spot.
It's a challenge.
It is. And, it kind of all ties back into this idea of Christian Pharisaism that we're exploring.
Right.
So how do you hold firm beliefs without falling into that trap of thinking you're better than everyone else?
That's the core issue, isn't it? And the article uses the term Christian Pharisaism to describe that spiritual arrogance.
Right.
Where you're certain of your own righteousness.
Yeah.
And it overshadows any kind of humility or reliance on God.
So it's not so much about what you believe.
Right.
It's how you approach it.
Exactly.
Okay. So unpack that a little bit for me.
Sure.
Because I get the historical connection to the Pharisees,
Yeah.
those guys in the Bible who were, super strict about the rule.
Exactly. They were devout,
Mm-hmm.
but they often missed, I think, the spirit of the law by being so fixated on the letter of it.
So focused on appearances and following every rule
Exactly.
rather than like genuine compassion.
Yeah, it was all about, outward appearances
Right.
rather than true inner transformation.
Okay, so the article gives some modern examples of what it considers Christian Pharisaism.
Mm-hmm.
It mentions Pastor Stephen Anderson and the Westboro Baptist Church.
Yeah.
There's some pretty controversial figures.
It's controversial for sure.
So before we dive into that, it's important to remember that, as you said before, this article is presenting a specific perspective.
It is, yeah.
And it's not necessarily a universally accepted view.
Right.
But from the author's point of view, they're using these examples to demonstrate how certain approaches to faith can veer into that judgmental territory and kind of lose sight of compassion and love.
Right. It's like their focus seems to be more on condemning others than on embodying love and grace.
So it's not just about what they believe, but how they're expressing it.
Yeah.
And I think that raises a really important question, which is, how do you stand up for your beliefs with conviction without coming across as arrogant or judgmental?
That is the million-dollar question for any person of faith, regardless of their specific beliefs.
Yeah.
It's something we all need to wrestle with.
It kind of reminds me of that saying, preach the gospel at all times, use words if necessary.
Oh, I love that.
It's about letting your actions speak louder than your words.
Yeah.
Showing your faith, not just talking about it.
Beautifully put.
So how does the article suggest we combat this kind of Christian Pharisaism?
Well, it really emphasizes shifting the focus from, winning arguments or forcing conversions to actually embodying Christ's humility and love.
So it's about being a Christ bearer.
Yeah.
Rather than this self-proclaimed champion of righteousness.
Exactly.
It's a powerful image, right?
It is.
To be a Christ bearer. To actually reflect, the love and grace of Jesus in everything you do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's a way of living that's less about proving yourself right.
Right.
And more about extending grace and compassion to others.
Mm-hmm.
Recognizing that ultimately God is the judge.
Oh, that's a humbling thought.
It is.
It kind of takes the pressure off of us.
Yeah.
To have all the answers or to try and save everyone around us.
Right. We're not in control.
Yeah.
We just got to trust.
And that's a really important reminder.
It is.
Especially with all the division in the world today.
Mm-hmm.
It's so easy to get caught up in those debates.
Yeah.
And needing to be right.
Absolutely.
But ultimately, it all comes down to love, doesn't it?
It always comes back to love.
Yeah.
A love that's rooted in humility.
Mm-hmm.
Recognizing our own imperfections and extending grace to others, even when we disagree.
Yeah.
It's not easy.
It's definitely not easy.
But it's the path the article is pointing towards.
A beautiful path, though.
It is.
I think it's been so insightful already. We've barely scratched the surface of this whole Christian Pharisaism thing.
Yeah.
I'm really curious to get into, the practical side of it all.
Yeah, how do we actually live this stuff out?
Exactly.
We'll get into that right after this.
We will.
As we're talking about this Christian Pharisaism, it's kind of striking how relevant it still is today.
Right.
Like this whole tendency to put on a show of righteousness instead of actually changing on the inside, It's like a very human thing.
It is.
Not even just a religious thing.
Totally. It's like we'd rather be seen as good than actually be good,
Yeah, exactly.
And the article doesn't hold back.
No, it doesn't.
It points out some pretty bold modern-day examples of this.
Right. It specifically calls out Pastor Stephen Anderson and the Westboro Baptist Church.
Yeah, those are
heavy hitters for sure.
No kidding.
Yeah.
And, before we dive into that too deeply, it's important to remember, like you said before, this article is presenting a specific perspective.
Right.
This isn't meant to be the final word on these groups.
Exactly.
Or their beliefs.
No, it's just one perspective.
But from the author's point of view, they're using these as examples to demonstrate how certain approaches to faith can kind of veer into that judgmental territory and lose sight of, compassion and love.
Right. And it seems like the author is taking issue not just with what they're saying, but how they're saying it.
Exactly. You hit the nail on the head.
The article suggests that that very aggressive confrontational style that's often associated with, these examples can actually be counterproductive.
Interesting.
To spreading a message of love and acceptance. It can almost push people away.
Right.
Rather than drawing them in.
So it's like the delivery method becomes a barrier
to
the message itself.
That's a brilliant way to put it.
I think so.
You know, it's like trying to understand someone speaking a language you don't know. Even if their words are kind.
Right.
You wouldn't get the message.
Exactly.
And in this case, you know, the article argues that the emphasis on condemnation and judgment.
Right.
It creates that same kind of communication breakdown.
So taking a step back then.
Yeah.
What's the big takeaway here?
Well, I think the article is really urging us, no matter our beliefs, to look inward.
Okay.
Are we truly living out our values? Or are we just putting on this show of righteousness for others?
It's a tough question to ask yourself.
Yeah.
But it's an important one, I think.
Absolutely.
And so what I'm hearing you say is that, you know, this is a call to really embrace humility.
Yes.
Choose love over judgment.
Absolutely.
And recognize that real change comes from within.
It does.
Not from forcing our beliefs on others.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
It's not about outward appearances or claiming to be right all the time.
It's not a competition.
It's about that genuine inner transformation that then shows up in how we treat each other.
Beautifully said.
And that kind of transformation, you know, it doesn't happen overnight.
It doesn't.
It takes a willingness to really let go of the ego. Admit that we don't have all the answers.
Yeah.
And just allow ourselves to be, you know, led by something bigger than ourselves.
Trusting in something beyond.
Yeah, that letting go part.
That's crucial.
It's surrendering, you know, surrendering to something bigger.
Yeah.
Trusting a higher power.
Right.
And just focusing on being, you know, instruments of love and kindness in the world.
And that's where I think this idea of being, you know, Christ bearers really comes into play. It's not about winning debates. Or proving how righteous we are.
It's not a badge of honor.
No, it's about reflecting Christ's love.
Right.
In every action, every interaction, every encounter.
Even when faced with, you know, disagreement or opposition.
Yes. That's where the real challenge lies.
And the reward, I think.
Absolutely. When we encounter people who hold different beliefs or even oppose our own.
Right.
We have the greatest opportunity to demonstrate the power of love and grace.
Instead of seeing them as like the enemy that we have to conquer.
Right.
You know, it's about seeing them as fellow travelers on this journey.
Beautifully said.
Everyone is trying to, you know, find their way.
Find truth and meaning in their own way.
And I think that recognition of our shared humanity.
Yeah.
You know, that willingness to extend grace even when we disagree is probably the most powerful antidote to this self-righteousness that we're talking about.
It is. It's a call to rise above that need to be right all the time, you know?
Let go of judgment.
Yeah.
Embrace a more compassionate and loving way of being in the world.
It's a challenge.
It is.
No doubt, but a beautiful one.
It is a beautiful one.
It's an invitation open to all of us.
It is. Regardless of our beliefs, because, you know, deep down, I think we all share that desire for, you know, genuine goodness.
Yeah.
That yearning for a world filled with love and understanding.
Absolutely.
This has been such a rich conversation.
It has.
But I'm left wondering, how do we actually put this into practice?
Right.
How do we move from, you know, theory to reality?
Talking the talk to walking the walk.
How do we go from talking about being Christ bearers to actually living it out?
That's the million-dollar question.
It is.
And luckily, that's exactly what we'll be exploring in the final part of our deep dive.
Okay, sounds good. All right, so we're back and ready to kind of wrap up our deep dive into this whole Christian Pharisaism idea.
Yeah.
You know, we've talked about the tension between holding strong beliefs and, you know, not becoming self-righteous.
Right.
We've looked at some examples.
Yeah.
And now I really want to kind of get practical, you know?
Yeah. How do we actually do this?
Exactly. How do we actually become these Christ bearers that the article's talking about?
It's one thing to say, be more loving, less judgmental.
Right.
But putting it into practice.
Right.
That's the hard part.
It's like reading a recipe versus actually cooking the meal, right?
Exactly.
You can know all the ingredients.
Yeah.
But until you actually get your hands dirty.
You don't know how it's going to turn out.
Yeah. And I think that's where sometimes it gets tricky.
It does.
Because, you know, the recipe for being a Christ bearer isn't like this rigid set of rules.
No.
It's really about cultivating this way of being, you know, this posture of the heart.
Yeah.
That's all about humility, compassion, and grace.
And that's hard to, you know, quantify.
It is.
Or put into a step-by-step process.
So where do we even begin?
Well, I think the article gives us some good hints.
Right.
Remember how it contrasts those who are so focused on winning arguments or forcing conversions with those who just strive to embody Christ's love.
It's like inviting someone to understand your perspective rather than trying to bulldoze their own,
Exactly. It's that shift from conquest to invitation.
I like that.
From judgment to understanding. It's huge.
Yeah.
It requires deep listening, empathy.
Meeting people where they are.
Yes.
Not trying to drag them to where we think they should be.
Beautifully put.
And it often means, letting go of our need to be right.
Absolutely.
To have all the answers, to control the outcome.
Yeah, letting go of that control.
Which can be so hard,
It is.
Especially in today's world where it feels like everyone's so convinced they're right.
Everyone's an expert.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But the article reminds us that, ultimately, God is the only judge.
That's right.
We're called to be witnesses, not prosecutors.
I love that.
Right.
Yeah.
It takes the pressure off.
It does.
Our job is to just, reflect God's love and leave the rest up to Him.
Trust in the process.
And I think that brings us back to humility.
Yeah.
Being a Christ bearer isn't about being the perfect Christian.
Right.
It's about recognizing our own flaws and extending that same grace to others.
Absolutely. It's about embracing the journey, the ups and downs.
The messiness of it all.
Yeah. Yeah. And trusting that God is with us every step of the way.
What a beautiful thought,
It is.
It makes this whole idea of Christian Pharisaism less about avoiding a label.
Yeah.
And more about cultivating, a way of life that's centered on love, humility, and grace.
It's a lifelong practice.
It is.
Constantly refining our hearts.
Right.
Aligning our actions with, the teachings of Christ.
So as we wrap up, I think the challenge for all of us, no matter what we believe, is to really consider how we could live this out.
Yeah.
How can we be more loving, more compassionate, more forgiving?
How can we let go of that need to be right?
Right.
Embrace different perspectives.
Trade judgment for grace.
Yeah.
Even with those who see things differently from us.
It's tough.
It is tough.
But it's worth striving for.
I think so.
Yeah.
These are questions worth chewing on.
Absolutely.
Long after this episode ends.
I hope so.
Me too.
And may our reflections lead us all to a deeper understanding of what it truly means to live a life filled with love and compassion.
Beautifully said.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
It was a pleasure.